So while I was gone, you and Devin did a video on installing an axle bearing retainer plate?
Yeah, we did. It was on a Tahitian Teal Tri Glide, Tahitian Teal, and a really nice bike. Nice paint job. I didn't even want to touch it or breathe on it, so we were really careful with it. And what we installed was the DK Custom axle bearing retainer plate. As you know, it's a heavy-duty retainer plate, vast improvement over stock, and we videoed the process because we felt like it'd be helpful to someone else. And it's actually a step-by-step video on how to change your axle bearing. So
Right.
I'm sure this video will be helpful to some, and we'll get on with it and go through the steps. But first, let's talk about why you developed the heavier-duty axle bearing retainer plate.
Well, this was back many years ago. Mary and I were getting ready to go on a trip on a particularly dangerous road to Bella Coola, gravel road with thousands of foot drop off with no guardrails. And we have a video on that. We'll link it above. We met a grizzly bear on that trip.
Okay.
But anyway, I had some looseness in the rear end. I thought it was the panhard rod, the heim joints. I replaced those. I still had that looseness, and Devin and I just started, doing process elimination, and we pulled out the axles, and we saw that the bearings are held in by this flimsy little pot metal bearing retainer plate.
Wow.
And they're supposed to be flat up against the bearing, holding it in place, but they were bowed. And you can see the witness marks where the bearing was just banging back and forth against this retainer plate.
And these photos are on the product page of our website.
Right.
There'll be a link
This
for that
is
below.
this is off of my 14 trike that we discovered this problem on. Look how banged up that bearing is, and that's from that bearing banging around inside the cast steel hub, axle hub, that holds the whole axle, bearing the axle into the trike. You can see that because the axle had that play in it, that the splines were starting to wear out, and then it's also not waterproof. So you see how water got into that's the hub that the bearing sits in.
Yeah, that's never good.
And water sat there long enough to start rusting that hub. So, we were getting ready to go on that trip, and Devin took the dimensions and everything and used the mill to build a heavy duty that's not going to flex, that's going to hold that bearing in place solid, keep that axle solid. And that's why we came up with it. We put that in. I was much more comfortable going on that road without the concern of having that loose rear end.
Great. All right, so let's get to the installation. Now, with all of our parts, not just trike parts, but Tri Glide installation in particular, if you don't feel comfortable doing the installation yourself, we always suggest having someone else do it. Take it to the shop, take it to the dealership, because it can be dangerous. Now, that's why we always suggest the very first step being secure the front end of the trike, whether it be with a wheel chock, strapping the front end to the floor, or securing the front brake with a strap, or in this case, what we used is a zip tie.
So it's always good to loosen the lug nuts before you lift the trike up in the air, because you don't want to have to be putting all that torque on it when it's on the stand. So just loosen them all. Don't take them off. Just loosen them all before you get it up in the air.
And you can see here we put 2x4s is what we used to bridge the gap between the rear cross members as a soft surface for the frame to rest on, also for a secure lifting point.
So and that wood goes across both cross members, so the weight of the trike is supported by both cross members.
Correct. And never do this installation with just the jack alone. You want to use jack stands. You want to have 2 jack stands, one on each side. Now the installation is much easier if you have an extra pair of hands to help you balance the trike as you jack it up to place the jack stands under it securely.
Okay, now that it's up in the air, go ahead and remove the lug nuts, remove the tires, set them aside.
If you ever taken the rear wheels off of a Tri Glide, it can be a fight with that rear fender, so do it carefully. You don't want to damage your paint.
Getting into the specifics of what you guys did in replacing these axle bearing retainer plates, the first step is to take out the 2 bolts that are holding the caliper in place. Once you have that caliper out, off of the rotor, zip tie that caliper up out of the way. Don't let it just hang by the lines.
Correct.
Then once you have the caliper off, you can pull the rotor off, set it aside.
Correct. The rotor's not fastened in place. It comes straight off.
When we did this the first time, we were a little intimidated. Oh, we're pulling the axles out of the Tri Glide. It's, you know, a difficult thing. It's not. We've taken 2 bolts out to get the rotor, to get the caliper off the rotor. And then there are 4 nuts that hold the axle in place. And you access those 4 nuts by these 2 holes. So you do 2 of the nuts, you turn it a little, line up with the other 2 nuts, and you pull those 2 nuts and out.
Right. Now, in some cases, you may need to use a slide hammer or an axle puller, depending on the age of the trike. But in all of our installations, we've done what, 3 of these now?
Yeah.
The axle comes straight out.
Yeah. So here's the other, taking the caliper off from the other side, you just gave a different angle. Correct. So you do everything on one side, then do everything on the other side.
You got a better view of those axle bearing retainer plate nuts here and how you access those.
The next step is, if you have a press, you can press the bearings and the bearing retainer off. They're both pressed on. After you take the C-clip out, the retaining clip out, press those off. If you don't have a press, you can go to a tire store, truck store, and they'll have a press that's strong enough to press those bearings off.
Now, the DK Custom plate is CNC precision cut, whereas the factory is just stamped, and it's much thinner and allows for flexing, which is not ideal to retain an axle bearing.
No, and there's no way that the axle bearing retainer plate, that the steel plate, that CNC cut, it's not going to have any flex in it at all. The other thing is that it has an O-ring that seals.
And be sure that when you're reassembling the axle bearing onto the axle, that when you put the retainer plate on, the groove side for the O-ring is facing up, or it's facing towards
the splines. Yeah, so you press those back on. We highly recommend getting new bearings. You can get new bearings, USA made, Federal Mogul bearings for, you know, $25-30 each. The last bearings that we took off that I looked at were made in Korea, the ones that came with the Harley. When you press the new bearing on and the same bearing retainer on, then make sure to put the clip back on. If the clip was damaged at all, the retainer clip was damaged at all when you took it off, you get a new one of those. And now we just put it back together exactly the same way we took it apart, making sure to use plenty of medium blue thread locker, making sure to torque it to specs. What are the specs?
Well, when you torque the bearing retainer plates down, they need to be torqued to 40 to 45 foot-pounds, and of course, blue medium thread locker must be used. The caliper bolts, they get torqued to 30 to 35 foot-pounds, also using blue medium thread locker. And of course, you repeat the process on the other side.
Once you get the tires back on, they get torqued, the lug nuts get torqued to 90 to 100 foot-pounds, and then ride the bike 50 to 100 miles and retorque the lug nuts. So if you all found the video useful, helpful, give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends. It's going to help them out.
Yeah, and please subscribe to our channel. It really helps us out. Won't cost you a thing.
Hit the notification bell. That way you'll know when we come out with a new video.
And if there's any DK Custom products you'd love to see an installation of, leave us a comment below.
Y'all ride safe out there.